The old Sith Wars devastated the Republic in a way no period of conflict ever had before, leaving it on the brink of collapse. As it struggled to rebuild, the people of the galaxy dared to hope that the worst was over, that the Sith had been defeated, but they were wrong. Ever since the Great Hyperspace War, the Sith, the True Sith, had been lurking out in the unknown regions, gathering their strength and rebuilding an empire, waiting until the Republic was weak enough for them to strike and exact their revenge. When they finally did, the war they made against the Republic was unlike any the Republic had fought before, and yet again, the way the Sith fought and built their empire had changed as well. In this video, we're going to be examining the military of the true Sith Empire, its history, and how it ultimately failed to topple the Republic.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
After the Great Hyperspace War of 5000 BBY, the Sith Empire was utterly destroyed by the Republic and the Jedi, but remnants of the Sith escaped to the far corners of the galaxy, where they spent the next millennium waiting for the moment to strike back. Some of these remnants died out in exile, while others joined Exar Kun in the Great Sith War, but the largest of these remnants took a different path. Led by a radical Sith sect and a powerful Dark Lord named Tenebrae, these true Sith gathered as much as they could of the old Sith Empire on Dromund-Kaas, from which they built their own empire in exile. The true Sith Empire was built around and largely dependent on Tenebrae, its Sith Emperor. Once a Sith Lord named Darth Vishit, born on one of the minor worlds of the old Sith Empire, Tenebrae had become unfathomably powerful through a ritual that allowed him to drain the Force from all living things on his homeworld, including numerous Sith Lords he'd gathered for the ritual. This gave him enormous dark-side power and a greatly extended life, allowing him to rule over his hidden empire for over 1,000 years. Tenebrae conditioned his people to be dependent on him during their long exodus from Sith space, and once on Dromund-Kaas, he reshaped the Sith into a new civilization of his own design. The empire Tenebrae built from Dromund-Kaas was much different from the original Sith Empire. Many traditions and key social structures of the old empire were abolished, and the Sith adopted a more conventionally structured society. The Sith Empire was centralized, not feudal, and the old Sith caste system was abolished, although the highest and lowest tiers of it persisted in different forms. The members of the Sith Order still ruled unquestioned over the Sith Empire, with absolute authority over nearly all non-Force sensitives, and an army of slaves still formed the lowest class of Sith society. While the ancient Sith's prejudice against non-Sith species persisted, and most aliens in the true Sith Empire were slaves, humans were made an exception to this rule, unlike in the original Sith Empire, and they ruled the Empire alongside the Sith purebloods. The non-Force sensitives among them made up the broad middle class of the Sith Empire's new hierarchy, with authority over the slaves, but subject to the rulers of the Empire. This middle class was where the biggest differences between the two Sith Empires could be found. The old warrior, engineer, and priest castes of the Sith were long gone, as the vast majority of the surviving Sith purebloods became part of the Sith Order, and the humans of the Sith Empire didn't have biologically distinct castes like the purebloods once did. Instead of trying to recreate these castes for their non-slave human subjects, the true Sith allowed them to choose their own paths in life, to an extent. All able-bodied adults were conscripted into the Sith military, but after their service was done, they lived as civilians, as did those who weren't able-bodied. Civilian society in the Sith Empire eventually became pretty similar to civilian society in the Republic, with three key differences. Ordinary citizens of the Sith Empire didn't even have the illusion of a say in government. Many citizens owned or otherwise depended on slaves, and both social and economic advancement were restricted to those who proved themselves superior in the Sith's eyes to their peers. While it retained the vague shape of the Sith society it was born from, the True Sith Empire was more similar to a dark mirror of the Republic than it was to its predecessor. Indeed, the True Sith seem to have taken outright inspiration from the Republic in building their society, and not just in the structure of their civilian society. Republic influences were even more prominent in the Sith's new military, which abandoned the old Massassi weapons, battle tactics, and war beasts for blasters and conventional tactics and technology. It's unknown when exactly these influences came into play. The Sith appear to have picked up on at least some of these things during the Great Hyperspace War and assimilated immediately, while others may have been introduced in subsequent centuries. Some of these tactics, norms, and technologies may have even come from Darth Revan's Sith Empire. But regardless of how these influences came to be, they made the True Sith Empire different from all those that had come before. But the influence of Republic technology also meant that there were a surprising number of similarities with Sith factions that had developed in isolation from the True Sith Empire. The True Sith followed a completely separate evolutionary path from the other heirs to the old Sith Empire, those who would eventually follow Exar Kun and Darth Revan in the old Sith Wars, but many of the adaptations the True Sith Empire underwent were similar to the innovations Darth Revan had made, and the True Sith built on some of these further. Like Revan's Sith Empire, the True Sith Empire had a conventional military built with Republic equivalent technology and run by a mix of Sith Lords and non-Force sensitive officers, but it also retained elements of the old Sith Empire that Exar Kun and Revan had discarded, such as the Sith Council, now renamed the Dark Council, and its systemic speciesism. It combined this unique mix of traits with new innovations like a developed civilian government and a more centralized and robust economy and industrial base, creating an empire that did far more damage to the Republic than any of its predecessors. While this video is about the True Sith Empire's military, we're going to start by briefly discussing the Empire's civilian populace, because, ironically, it was actually one of the biggest tactical advantages the True Sith Empire had over its predecessors. Neither Exar Kun's nor Darth Revan's Sith Empires had any semblance of civilian government, and civilian life was barely an afterthought to the Sith Lords that ran those empires. Exar Kun's Sith coalition had no real civilian population, just an eclectic military and an army of slaves supplying it, while Darth Revan's Sith Empire was essentially just a military machine that kept an eye on conquered populations, extracted resources from them, and otherwise didn't interfere with civilian life. This was a crippling weakness for both of them. It left them without any real base of support to fall back on once the tide turned against them. Their empires were just their militaries, and so when their armies were defeated, they evaporated and the people they conquered went on with their lives, with most never having had any real loyalty to the Sith anyway. But the True Sith Empire not only had a substantial civilian populace, but one that had been utterly indoctrinated into the ideology of the Sith. Centuries of propaganda, Tenebrae's manipulation, and isolation from direct outside influence had created an army of civilians that was genuinely loyal to the Sith Empire. The people of the Sith Empire feared and hated the Jedi and the Republic. They believed wholeheartedly in the Sith principle of rule by the strong, and as a consequence, they accepted the rule of the Sith Lords, who they knew to be stronger than they. As the Sith Lords could rely on their massive slave population to do most of the hard labor, citizens could be given enough small freedoms and amenities that they were comfortable enough with their lives, unlike the subjects of the original Sith Empire. This was a people that wouldn't only serve the Sith Lords willingly, but that would resist the Republic ferociously, even if the armies of the Sith were utterly defeated, allowing the Sith Empire to rebound given a generation or two. During the Great Galactic War, this loyalty caught the Republic off guard. The subject populations of previous Sith Empires, which were largely enslaved or kept in line through violence alone, had often welcomed Republic forces as liberators in previous wars, and it had expected the populations of conquered true Sith worlds to react similarly. Of course, the True Sith Empire still had a massive slave population, and while slaves were also thoroughly indoctrinated by the Sith, they were also treated brutally, both by the Sith and by citizens, which typically made this indoctrination far less effective. Slave revolts were one of the greatest threats to the stability of the Sith Empire, but the brutal reprisals Sith responded with meant they were rare. Nonetheless, the Sith Empire's reliance on slavery was a key strategic weakness that somewhat offset the advantages of its loyal civilian populace, especially since most of the Empire's industry was reliant on slave labor. The True Sith Empire also had a complex bureaucracy and civilian government which no Sith Empire before had had. This government was highly centralized, and it often blurred the lines between Sith, military, and bureaucratic authority, but it was still more developed and well-rounded than Sith government before. Its highest levels were based on the structure of the original Sith Empire's government. At the top was the Sith Emperor, a title held by Tenebrae for most of the Empire's history, who presided over the Dark Council, the successor to the 12-member Sith Council of the Old Empire. While the Old Sith Council had consisted of 10 Sith Lords presided over by the ruling Dark Lord of the Sith and their Shadow Hand, the 12 members of the Dark Council all had the rank of Dark Lord of the Sith, while Tenebrae ruled over all of them as Emperor. A few power players in the Sith Empire, including the elite Sith known as the Emperor's Hand, the Emperor's Wrath, and the Children of the Emperor, answered directly to Tenebrae, while pretty much everyone else answered to the Dark Council. Unlike the old Sith Empire, which was administered through a feudal system in which each Sith Lord ruled a portion of the Empire, the True Sith Empire was much more centralized, and the members of the Dark Council instead presided over spheres of influence, overseeing a different aspect of government rather than ruling over their own territories. Each sphere consisted of one or more ministries, bureaus, and agencies, and some had greater importance in the Empire than others. The most important spheres oversaw the Sith Empire's 3 ministries, which were the backbone of the government. These were the Ministry of Logistics, the Ministry of Intelligence, and the Ministry of War, all of which played vital roles in the Sith military. The Ministry of Logistics was part of the sphere of production and logistics, while the Ministry of Intelligence was part of the sphere of intelligence, but the Ministry of War was overseen by 3 different spheres entirely: the sphere of military offense, the sphere of defense of the Empire, and the sphere of military strategy. 2 other spheres, the spheres of ancient knowledge and mysteries, oversaw key operations of the Sith Order, while the remaining 5 spheres oversaw civilian government. Of them, the sphere of Sith philosophy oversaw indoctrination, the spheres of technology and biotic science oversaw scientific research, the sphere of expansion and diplomacy handled diplomatic relations, and the sphere of law and order enforced the Empire's laws. Most of these ministries and bureaus were largely staffed by citizens and only answered to the Sith at the highest levels, but the Sith themselves were heavily involved in some of the others, and they also oversaw the operations of the Sith military. The Sith Order, of course, had its own internal hierarchy, so we're going to talk about that before we move on to the military itself. Prospective Sith began their training as Sith acolytes at the Sith Academy on Korriban, competing with other acolytes to win the favor of their overseers. Those who survived and were deemed worthy became Sith apprentices, apprenticed to a Sith Lord until they proved themselves worthy to become a Sith Lord in their own right. The greatest Sith Lords were granted the ancient title of Darth, and the greatest Darths would earn a seat on the Dark Council, becoming a Dark Lord of the Sith. Darths, lesser Sith Lords, and Sith apprentices all had a degree of authority within the Sith military, but they took command of military units mainly on an ad hoc basis, and the military itself had its own hierarchy. Naturally, the Imperial military of the Sith Empire was overseen by the Ministry of War. The military was run by the Moffs, a class of governor-generals that oversaw all military assets across large sector theaters, with the highest-ranking Moff earning the title Grand Moff, a position with special privileges and direct access to the Dark Council. If Moff and Grand Moff sound familiar, that's because they were actually Republic titles given to the rulers of small empires that chose to join the Republic, which the True Sith apparently decided to borrow for use in their own military. The Moffs made up Imperial High Command and Imperial Military Command, and they oversaw the entire Imperial military with authority over all military branches. Below them, the military hierarchy was generally divided between different branches, with the main ones being the Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy. There were some other cross-branch units, however, such as Imperial Search and Recovery. But let's start with the Imperial Army. The Sith Imperial Army was mainly made up of heavily armored Sith troopers, also known as Imperial Heavy Infantry soldiers. Since most of the Sith Empire's Sith purebloods were part of the Sith Order, and since most other alien species were slaves, the vast majority of these soldiers were human, and they operated similarly to the Sith troopers of Darth Revan's Sith Empire. These Sith troopers were well trained, taught basic weapons, first aid, and survival skills before being subjected to live fire drills in the treacherous jungles of Dromund Kaas. Sith troopers were outfitted in black and grey full-body Duraplast armor, which was worn over a protective body glove. Weighing about 100 pounds total, this armor was quite heavy, but it also provided much better protection against blaster fire than the plastoid armor favoured by the Republic's elite troopers. The helmet of this armor contained a sophisticated computer interface, a targeting HUD, and communication system, and the armor featured life support mechanisms to keep wounded troopers alive. On top of this armor, Sith troopers were equipped with 5 days of rations, extra ammunition and grenades, and, of course, weapons, typically TH-17 blaster rifles or DLA-13 heavy blaster rifles. Apart from standard Sith troopers, the Imperial Army included a number of Sith trooper variants, some of which were deployed in their own units, and some of which were mixed in with regular units. Grenadiers had green markings on their armor and came equipped with a larger supply of explosive weapons, while shock troopers had white markings, were typically more heavily armed and armored, and fought in the thickest fighting. The most skilled Sith troopers were the white armored Sith commandos, which hunted priority targets and often collaborated with Imperial intelligence. Some specialized Sith troopers were part of their own distinct subunits of the army. These included the members of the Imperial Sniper Corps, who wore camouflaged armor and carried sniper rifles, and recon troopers, who wore lighter armor, carried K-406 sniper rifles, and were part of Imperial reconnaissance. The most elite Sith troopers were part of Imperial Special Forces, which had access to more advanced equipment and which were given greater tactical flexibility in battle. All parts of the Imperial Army followed the same rank structure and order of battle, but units could vary in size depending on their composition, which complicated the order of battle somewhat. Sith troopers entered the army at the rank of private, but those who proved themselves would soon be promoted to the rank of specialist. Above specialist were the lower tier officer ranks, the ranks of corporal, sergeant, ensign, and lieutenant in that order. Corporals commanded the smallest unit in the Imperial Army, the fire team, which consisted of 2 or 3 Sith troopers, led by the corporal. The next unit up, the squad, consisted of 5 to 10 troopers led by a sergeant or an ensign. 10 squads or 50 to 100 troopers made up a platoon commanded by a lieutenant. 100 to 300 soldiers formed a company commanded by a captain, while 700 to 1,500 soldiers formed a battalion commanded by a major. 5,000 to 7,500 soldiers formed a brigade commanded by a colonel, while 20,000 to 40,000 soldiers formed the largest official unit, the division, which was commanded by a general. General was the highest rank within the Imperial Army, with generals answering directly to the Moffs or to Sith Lords. Moffs and Sith Lords could group divisions together into larger informal units known as assault groups or operations groups, which the Moff or Sith Lord would command directly. In battle, Sith troopers were often supported by war droids, at least some of which were actually part of their own branch of the military, the Imperial Automated Defense Corps. The True Sith Empire made use of a ton of different war droids models. The most prominent, which included the Guardian NS-55 Enforcer, the C-Series war droid, the Mark 1 and 2 Sith war droids, and their many variants, were heavily armed, slow-moving assault droids, similar in role to the later Droideka. Others, including the V-359 Guard droid, the Mark 4 Sentinel, the DK-27 Guardian, the NS-36 Enforcer, and the OHK-99, were more typical battle and security units, while yet others, including the XR-32 Hunter droid and the ISF-E4 Eliminator, were assassin droids. A few, most prominently the OT-12 series of war droids and the Ravager droid, were essentially light droid tanks. Most served pretty much the same role, providing heavy fire support for infantry units. Infantry units were also supported by an array of armored vehicles. Light walkers of several models provided basic fire support, while larger crawler tanks served as siege platforms. The Army's spaceborne counterpart was the Sith Imperial Navy, a vast armada that served as the Sith Empire's main weapon. The Navy was overseen by Imperial Fleet Command and divided into a variety of fleets, which primarily consisted of Harrower-class dreadnoughts and Terminus-class destroyers. The latter were escorts derived from older Sith battleship classes, while the former seems to have been influenced by Republic designs and served as a frontline heavy cruiser. These capital ships were supported by swarms of starfighters, bombers, and gunships, most prominently the Mark VI Supremacy-class starfighter and the B-28 Extinction-class bomber. Unlike the Republic, the True Sith Empire considered its fighter wings part of its navy, and it rarely deployed fighters on their own. While the full order of battle of the Imperial Navy is unknown, we do have detailed information about its rank system. The basic rank in the Imperial Navy was private, above which were the ranks of specialist, corporal, and sergeant, like in the Army. Above the rank of sergeant was the rank of petty officer, then ensign, lieutenant, commander, and finally captain. Captains served as the commanders of capital ships, and they answered to group captains who commanded small task forces. Group captains answered to commodores who answered to admirals. The highest rank of the Imperial Navy was Grand Admiral, which answered directly to the Moffs and the Sith Lords. Apart from the Imperial Army, Navy, and Automated Defense Corps, there were two other branches of the Imperial military that actually answered to government branches other than the Ministry of War. The first of these was the Imperial Medical Corps, which was part of the sphere of biotic science, and which provided medics and field doctors to support Imperial military units. The other was Imperial Intelligence, which was part of the Ministry of Intelligence and involved all manner of black ops missions and espionage. Imperial Intelligence was a complex organization, one that worked closely with the Sith Lords, and we won't get into all its internal intricacies, but before we move back to the history, we'll at least discuss its internal ranks. The lowest rank was Informer, a mix of spies, scouts, and informants who answered to ciphers, elite field agents that did the most dangerous work intelligence had to offer, from sabotage to assassination. Ciphers answered to minders, who served as internal OPSEC and information processors, and they answered to fixers. Fixers were technical agents who sometimes carried out slicing operations on their own, but who usually just processed the data sent to them by the minders, which they forwarded to Watchers, the overseers of intelligence divisions. The Watchers, in turn, reported to the Keeper, the official leader of Imperial Intelligence, who reported directly to the Minister of Intelligence. The sprawling military machine was all designed for a single purpose: to utterly destroy the Republic and its Jedi protectors. Its structure had been dreamed up by Odile Viken, the first Grand Moff, and it had taken many centuries for the True Sith to build. For over 1,000 years, the Sith Emperor tested the strength of his forces against numerous alien civilizations in the depths of the Rim, expanding the core territories of his empire in the process. By around 4000 BBY, 1,000 years after the Great Hyperspace War, the Armada was nearing completion, and Tenebrae began the next stage of his plan. He orchestrated the Mandalorian Wars and Jedi Civil War to destabilize the Republic, and once the Republic was in tatters, he prepared to strike. But Tenebrae delayed his plans after Revan attempted to assassinate him. The attack failed, and Revan was imprisoned, but Revan was able to influence Tenebrae from his prison, causing the Sith Emperor to delay the invasion for several more centuries. This gave the Republic room to recover, but nonetheless, when the war finally began, it was devastating, and the Republic lost more than it ever had before. In 3681 BBY, the True Sith Empire revealed itself and began an all-out war against the Republic, beginning the Great Galactic War. The Sith swiftly conquered the Tinjal Arm, the Outer Hydian, and the Old Worlds of the Sith Empire, most notably Korriban and Ziost, in short order. Both the Navy and the Army used aggressive tactics, and their numbers and aggression both proved overwhelming, leaving the Republic scrambling to respond. As the True Sith consolidated their power base in the galaxy's northeastern quadrant, a region that would become known as the seat of the Empire, they began expanding across the Outer Rim, seizing parts of the Outer Rim a trade route and driving the Republic from many of its rimward territories. The Sith advance up the Rimmer soon stalled, and Sith forces in the southern rim moved toward the Corellian Run, securing a foothold in the trailing sectors and attacking Bothan space. The Republic repulsed 2 attacks on Bothan space, however, and though the Sith more or less took control of the Outer Rim, the Republic was able to hold the line in the mid-rim for many years. Tenebrae, recognizing that his forces were overextended and that he had lost his momentum, was forced to cut his losses and slow the pace of the conquest. From this point forward, the war became a slog, and the Sith and Republic seemed more evenly matched. In 3667 BBY, however, the Sith began to strike further into Republic space, even launching an attack on Alderaan in the core worlds. These attacks were largely thwarted, but they were often costly, and on some coreward battlefields, such as Balmorra, Sith forces remained entrenched for the rest of the war. In the years that followed, the tide of the war slowly began to turn back in the Sith's favor. This was partly due to a major Sith naval victory at Hoth in 3665 BBY, but the most important contribution was actually made by a third party, the Mandalorians. Despite the strength of the True Sith's military forces, the small size of the Sith's initial empire and the vast swath of territory it had conquered up to this point had left it seriously overextended, forcing the Sith to turn to more underhanded tactics to weaken the Republic. Thus, Sith agents engineered a Mandalorian blockade of the Hydian Way, which threatened to destroy the Republic economy. In 3660 BBY, this blockade was broken, but the damage was already done by this point. The Republic had been weakened enough to allow Sith forces to start gaining ground again, and the Sith would remain on the offensive for the rest of the war. In 3653 BBY, 28 years into the Great Galactic War, this advance culminated in the sacking of Coruscant. After luring the Republic into a false sense of security by proposing a peace conference on Alderaan, the Sith launched a surprise attack on Coruscant itself. After the Mandalorian mercenary Shae Vizsla deactivated Coruscant's defense grid, a team of Sith warriors attacked the Jedi Temple, while a massive Sith fleet began a bombardment of Galactic City. In the end, the Jedi Temple was utterly destroyed, half of the Jedi Council and numerous other Jedi were killed, the Supreme Chancellor was murdered, and Galactic City was utterly devastated. Following the battle, the Republic delegates on Alderaan were forced into signing the Treaty of Coruscant, which ended the Great Galactic War. With the signing of the treaty, the Sith abandoned Coruscant and let the Republic reclaim its capital, but this came at the cost of massive territorial concessions, which put the Sith in control of half of the known galaxy. The Great Galactic War was over, and the Sith Empire had won. But while the Sith had won the war, they'd failed to accomplish their objective. They'd only conquered half of the known galaxy, not the whole thing, and the Republic and Jedi Order were only weakened, not destroyed. Many in the Sith Empire were unsatisfied and wondered why the Sith Emperor had decided to negotiate a truce, but the answer soon became clear. The Imperial military still lacked the size and strength to conquer the whole galaxy, and if it made the attempt, it would overextend itself and the Republic would win in the end. But the Treaty of Coruscant handed half the galaxy to the Sith, giving them a vast new pool of conscripts, resources, and industrial facilities to incorporate into their war machine. The Sith would use the peace to amass a new, even greater armada, and then they would finish off the Republic. For 12 years, the galaxy was locked in the Cold War, a tense standoff between the Republic and Sith Empire, which saw the Sith gather their strength, conduct espionage and sabotage, and prepare for the next war. That war, the Galactic War, finally began in 3641 BBY as the Sith Empire resumed its attempted conquest of the galaxy. At first, the Sith had the advantage, establishing a foothold on Corellia and pushing ever deeper into Republic space, But a series of costly defeats, a rise of infighting among the members of the Dark Council, and the assassination of Tenebrae by a Jedi strike team caused the tide of the war to turn. With the Emperor dead, the Dark Council in turmoil, and the military suffering heavy casualties against the resurgent Republic military, the Sith began to lose ground, and the Sith Empire began to weaken. The situation only worsened for the Sith as members of the Sith Order began to defect to Sith splinter groups, among them Darth Malgus's new Empire and the Order of Revan. This period of chaos was complicated by the revelation that Tenebrae's real goal wasn't to establish a galaxy-spanning empire, but to recreate the ritual he'd conducted to gain his power on a much larger scale, allowing him to consume all life in the galaxy. This caused the Dark Council to turn against Tenebrae, purging his remaining influence from the Sith Empire. The Sith Lords Darth Maul and Lana Beniko even established a tentative pact with the Republic to work together against Tenebrae should he return. But when he ultimately did return, they proved unprepared, for he returned as Emperor Valkorion, the ruler of the Eternal Empire, a new power that he had been quietly building deep in the unknown regions as a backup plan. In 3036 BBY, the Eternal Empire unexpectedly entered the Galactic War, and since both the Republic and the Sith Empire had already exhausted their forces fighting each other, both fell to the new power. Within a few years, the Eternal Empire had effectively seized control of the galaxy, reducing the Republic and Sith Empire to proxies. The Sith Empire initially resisted the Eternal Empire, but the loss of Darth Maul and most of the surviving members of the Dark Council left it unable to effectively resist for long. Eventually, the last surviving member of the Dark Council, Darth Asina, declared herself Empress and signed a treaty with the Eternal Empire, buying the Sith Empire time to rebuild. As the tattered Sith military regrouped, Asina reformed the Sith Empire's government, completing the purge of Tenebrae's influence and reorganizing the Empire's increasingly bloated bureaucracy. The Dark Council was reformed, but reduced to just 5 members, with the spheres of influence consolidated into the spheres of military command, Sith doctrine, civil administration, scientific advancement, and galactic influence. As the Sith Empire rebuilt, Darth Asina led it in joining the Eternal Alliance, which the Republic was also a part of, a coalition meant to bring down the Eternal Empire. They staged an uprising against the Eternal Empire, destroying Tenebrae once and for all and dismantling his armies. The Eternal Alliance briefly assumed rule of the galaxy, but it was soon torn apart by infighting over control of the ancient war machines the Eternal Empire had used to fuel its conquest. These machines were ultimately destroyed, but the Eternal Alliance fragmented all the same, and in 3628 BBY, a third galactic war between the Republic and the Sith Empire began. As Darth Asina was killed during the conflict over the machines of Eokath, Darth Voron became the new Sith Emperor, leading Asina's reformed empire in the new war against the Republic. Once more, the Sith made a play for control of the galaxy, but by this point, the true Sith Empire had lost a lot of its strength and momentum, and over the course of the ensuing century, it slowly began to die. As Star Wars: The Old Republic is still telling the story of the Third Galactic War, the exact fate of the true Sith Empire is unclear, but we can infer the broad strokes of the story. Throughout the Galactic Wars, and especially during and after the time of Darth Asina, the Sith Empire had slowly become less authentically Sith, as the principles of the Sith were compromised in pursuit of a more stable empire. This worsened the existing schisms among the Sith, with Darth Malgus and other schismatics leading groups of Sith against the Empire. All the while, the Sith Empire's much reduced military was slowly worn down by the superior numbers and industrial capacity of the Republic, which steadily reclaimed its lost territory. In the end, one way or another, the seat of the Empire fell to the Republic, and the true Sith Empire was either cast down or torn apart from within. Remnants of the true Sith persisted until around 3500 BBY, and some, such as Darth Desolus, built armies of their own, either from fragments of the Sith Empire or their own bases of power, but they also failed to topple the Republic. In the ensuing centuries, Sith Lords arose now and again, including Salo Morn and possibly Darth Phobos, but all were swiftly defeated, and they failed to make much of an impact on the galaxy. By 2000 BBY, the Sith were believed defeated yet again. No new Sith Lords had arisen for centuries, and the society the True Sith had built in the heart of their empire either died out or was destroyed. The Sith worlds were depopulated yet again, and the Sith purebloods became extinct. This time, there were no surviving fragments of the Sith Empire scattered across the Outer Rim. No more armies in exile waiting for the chance to return and exact revenge. But there were still fragments of the Sith Order scattered far and wide across the Outer Rim. These remnants of the Sith were little more than cults, with few followers and no armies to lead against the Republic, but they kept the teachings of the Sith alive for more than 1,000 years, waiting patiently for a new Dark Lord to arise and lead them to war. In 2000 BBY, 1500 years after the defeat of Darth Decius, that new Dark Lord finally arrived, unleashing a new kind of Sith threat upon the galaxy. But that's a story for another time. So, what do you think? Would you like to see more videos about the True Sith? What's your favorite era of Sith history? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.